Greetings. We'll make another lid vid here, and this one will be on how we segue from natural selection, I'll put that up on a screen, into religion. I just want to tell people up front that I know when we talk about religion, and specifically when we talk about questioning religion or questioning the existence of a God, that gets in into very sensitive territory. I'm fully aware of that, and by learning and about this concept and by talking about it, we are by no means telling people what to believe or how they should behave. We're simply laying out the facts, and in this case, the facts of what natural selection means and what it possibly, and I'm going to emphasize possibly, one entailment for religion. Okay, so natural selection, if you remember from the reading that you had to rotate and read, the technology and natural process. Natural selection is defined as, I'll put this up on the screen too, a passive process. Passive is going to be key. A passive process whereby genetic traits get selected in or selected out of a species. In the last video, I talked about how human tails, we have genes for that. They're no longer dominant. So way, way back into our genetic history. But we used to have tails, and we're descendant of creatures that have tails.
And of course, I have tails to show you, cat tails to show you, because we always got to have a visual, right?
But tails were in our ancestral history at one point, but got selected out as a gene because they no longer because they were no longer useful. So we now have the ability to walk upright and balance on 2 feet. We are bipedal, and these types of gene clusters to walk upright and to have 2 pedals, 2 feet, and to migrate are the genes that then became dominant and took over, say, a tail gene. Again, I told you, and if you haven't done it yet, Google human tail. It's kind of a trip. And some people are still born with tails, but it's because it's so rare and most of the species does not have tails, we say having a tail is not a genetic trait of being a human. Okay, so that's an instance, that's an example of where natural selection over time took a gene and selected it out. Bye-bye tail. Okay, so what's selected in? Well, I mentioned being bipedal, being upright, having 2 eyes, breathing with lungs. I mean, all these types of things are traits, genetic traits that we have selected in to help us survive in certain contexts. So the reason they're selected in, I want to emphasize this also, is not because the genetic traits are better or the best ones we could have. They are just useful and were useful at the time. So fitness equals usefulness, not better. And that's just kind of a clarification that, well, pet peeve of mine, but I think could assist you. So if natural selection is doing all the picking of the genes, it decided this process, this passive process, and we'll come back to the passive part. This passive process decided that, like, I was going to get this gene from my mother and this genes from my father and some from ancestors way back, and that I was not born with the tail. I keep losing my tail, but so all of that was determined by kind of random genetic roulette. Like, you spin the genetic wheel, you mix it up, and the place where sperm and egg get mixed up. That was a strange thing to say.
And what comes out? Well, in this case, again, I could point out like the features that I have that are of my mother, the ones that are of my father, and then I don't have a tail and I don't have webbed fingers. I think some of those things could be cool, but I don't have them. So I can, again, create technologies to have webbing.
How many times do I need to show you my tail? I can get tails if I really need one.
So these genetic clusters happen because people, if we're talking about humans, but two members of a species decide to reproduce or just do reproduce. And I wish I could show you my cat, who is now taken up with the tail. But it's through reproduction that these genetic traits get passed on. And it's not just your ancestry. When we look at genetic traits of the human, we're looking at the genetic traits that like all of us got reproduced by, or that all of us continue to reproduce. So again, if you were to reproduce, it is most likely, it is expected, barring genetic mutation or some type of complication, that the specimen, the creature you create via reproduction, would have two eyes, would have lungs to breathe, would have all the different various things, certainly like external and anatomical things that humans have, but also a lot of the stuff in the brain can be genetically determined. And it's through reproduction. And then we look around the whole species and it's like, well, what does every human seem to be, and not every, but most humans seem to have in common? And that's where we find the traits that define being human.
Okay, now what the heck would this have to do with religion? Okay, we're going to go back to the part where we said that natural selection is passive. Passive means, in this context, that it's not intentional. It's just kind of random. It just happens. You know how they say shit happens? Well, if ever that phrase was applicable, more applicable or applicable, I think it's in the context of natural selection. It just happens. When I'm going to give you some weird images here to think about, but when two people are having a baby, mixing the sperm with the egg in the sperm egg container, which sperm gets to the egg? It's just random which one does. Which egg dropped at that time? It's just pretty freaking random. And so, which set of genes are being carried once you get that mixture of the egg and the sperm is just random. It's not predetermined. It's not intentional. It is according to science. Emphasis, according to science, and in the context of evolution, that whole process is random and passive and not intentional and not predetermined. There was no way I was supposed to turn out. If we take this view, there was no way you were supposed to turn out. There was no way that the continents were supposed to divide. They just did. Like if I stick with the continents, drought and storm, and the earth just started moving apart because it did, because of external circumstances that just happened. I'm going away from biology with that one, but I'll do it one more time with the derecho. Why did the derecho come and hit Cedar Rapids and surrounding areas? It just did. I mean, there's a much more satisfying explanation if we get into weather science as to how this happened and why it happened. But did it have to happen? Like, was the derecho determined? Did we have to face that? And the answer is no. It's just, in that case, really shitty luck. So it just shit happened. And in that case, it was a derecho. And again, my heart still breaks for people who went through that and are still dealing with the consequences of it. But it's an example of how random life can be. So I went to derecho and to continent forming. That's not biological. So let's go back to genetic traits. I think they were useful for illustration, I hope, anyway. we go back to genetic traits. It's like, why did I get the kind of hazily green eyes that I did when my siblings, some of them have brown eyes. I think they all have brown eyes except me. But so why? And it just shit happens. It just did. Okay, so the passive, non-intentional, random aspect to natural selection. It's like, which way is the wind blowing? What are the weather conditions? What kind of food sources do we have? How tall are the trees in terms of can we reach the food source? I mean, all these things that determine our survival are pretty random. And if that's the case, if all of this is being determined randomly based on the external circumstances at the time and whether or not it would be useful to throw in a trait at the time, if all of this is just kind of not determined, then what we have is a situation in which a god or a supreme being or an intentional designer could be eliminated from the explanation.
Because in this case, we wouldn't need it. Why do I have hazily green eyes? It's because we just look at the genetics of my father and my mother, and we study the genetics of dominant recession, blah, blah, and randomness, and boom, you get that thing. So when we talk about how did I get my eyes, we don't need to bring in a god. If we talked about how, now my cat took off with my tail, but remember what it looks like. If we talked about how tails got selected out, it's kind of random. It's like the conditions somehow forced us to become more upright and to be bipedal, and the tail became unnecessary. Like I said in the last video, could we still have tails? Sure. Because nothing's really set in stone. It doesn't have to be this way. It just is. So what I said there, this is where people like to debate, and it's a great place to debate. It's a great place to have deliberate, kind dialogue about what is needed in explanation of the universe and how species work. And then, of course, we're tying all this to why we create technologies. If we go strictly with the scientific view, you can only say that which you have evidence for. So you can only say something and posit it if there is enough evidence to sustain its truth, that we could show repeatedly over time, test it and test it and test it again, that this is going to be the case. If I stick with eyes, it's like, yeah, pretty much every time people reproduce, not every time, most of the time people reproduce, they can expect, and a reproduction comes to term, you can expect that the baby will have two eyes. So that one's pretty well tested, that genetic trait, that gene, will stick with us. Could you be born with eye defects? Yes, of course, and some people are. And there's no reason why it happened other than something in the genetic lineage, some DNA, RNA signal got, we don't say confused, but something sort of malfunctioned. I hate saying that because I don't care what differences are in people, but something different happened and the genetic outcome was the same. Now, was it caused by a god, which is often defined as a supreme being, an omniscient, all-knowing, omnipotent, all-powerful being that controls everything in the universe? But when we go into science and we look at the genetics of eyes and we look at the genetics of like, how did this rock form and how did these continents form? We don't lift up rocks and see like, oh, look, here's God under this rock. And when we start studying our eyes and how they got the color they did and passed on through reproduction, we don't say, oh, look, and there's God pushing the genes along. We don't see God in nature. And I know some people think that nature is the work of God, so there's a way that you do see God in nature, but according to evolution, we can't bring in any concept or any explanatory idea to try and explain something if that idea isn't needed or isn't evidenced. It isn't supported. So we don't see God in biology. We see cells, we see lots of cool and complicated things happening, get into molecular biology, genetic biology, evolutionary biology, all this kind of stuff. You will get deeper and deeper into the science of cells and reproduction and genetics, but you will not get deeper into the science or knowing of God. It's just not on the table in a scientific program. So scientists cannot talk about what they don't know about. So it's like when it comes, if you ask a scientist who studies natural selection, it's like, so do you think there's a God? They would have to say, oh, there could be. Or maybe that person actually believes there is. But they wouldn't believe that based on any of the evidence they found in science. And that's really all it is. It's like science just doesn't give us evidence for the existence of a God. So we have to keep it out. That's why natural selection is called passive. It just happens. Now that part to accept evolution, you do have to accept the notion of natural selection. And that part kind of freaks people out. Because there are many combinations that people would like to have where you keep evolution and you keep God in the picture too. So some people say, I believe everything about evolution, I'm down with science, but I just think God started it all. Fine, that's viable. We'll still ask, what's your evidence for God? But that's another story, that's another video. I even have some videos like that posted. So you might believe that God is actually driving the show and reject the idea that natural selection is passive and say that it's active because there's a God that's determining the whole process. Excuse me. You can certainly say that. Anyone can believe that. It's just that all I wanted to be clear with here is that it's not what evolutionary biology says, and it's not part of the definition of natural selection. So can you believe part of evolution and part of religion? Of course you can. Can you reject all of evolution and only believe that God is running the show? Of course you can. Can you believe that there's a giant bunny rabbit hopping around and controlling the universe? Of course you can. I'm sure you've heard about like flying spaghetti monster theories. You can believe in anything you want. The question becomes, at the end of the day, with your beliefs, is what in reality supports them. And since we're learning and we're in a context that is learning based on evidence, this is not a faith-based environment. School typically is not. We leave faith, and those leaps of faith we take to believe things that we can't prove. We just leave it out. That's all this means. So if one is an evolutionist, they believe in natural selection, they believe it's passive, do they not believe in God? Here are some possibilities. Possibility one, they don't believe in God. They just believe in the things that we can see, hear, touch, taste, smell, and that we can actually prove. That's one possibility. Two, second possibility, you could believe in evolution and think, I'm not sure. I think there might be a God. There might be something, there maybe should be something kind of running the show, but I'm not sure. That's the first one would be atheist, you're without theism. The second one would be agnostic. You're skeptical, you're doubtful, you just don't know yet. So that's a possibility. And then probably now we get into more percentage of people would go this route. They'd say, okay, I buy science, I'm down with that. So there's third possibility. I'll take natural selection, but not the passive part. So they would believe in evolution, but definitely believe that God is running the show. Or if they don't think that God is running all the genetic details, they at least think God kicked off the program and there's a God that way. So that actually becomes 3 and 4 possibilities, where God started it and then kind of hangs back and lets natural selection do its thing, or God started it and continues to be dominant and present in all of the natural selection stuff going on. Other possibilities. Well, like I said, you can chuck all of science and just keep religion. You can chuck all of religion and just keep science, or you can find little mixtures of the two that make sense to you and that suit you. So this is why we segue to religion. aside from the fact that religion has a great deal to do with how we determine and formulate and accept technologies, it also just naturally falls out of this concept of natural selection and evolution. So I wanted to make that clear for you. Well, as usual, let me know if you have questions. This is usually a fun one to debate face to face, like, well, what about this for reasons of God? And what about this for reasons of God? I have a video I made for another class that I'll link you to in case you want to go further with that kind of debate. And certainly if you want to chat with me about it, that kind of stuff, that would be very cool. So I hope you are well, and I'm going to sign off on this lid vid. So in a nutshell, what do we have? Natural selection, a passive mechanism whereby genetic traits get selected in or out of a species. Passive, meaning no intention, no predeterminedness about it, no mind guiding it. So another way we could say that is there's no God, there's no God or supreme being driving the show. It just happens. And that part is obviously contentious and objectionable to some, and some are quite comfortable with it. And it's just a diverse world we live in with different points of views. And that is just a view you can take. So hence we move to religion. Okay, I'll see you in the next lid vid.